probably get hello everyone. My name is Erin Youngstrom. I am the Fund Development and Outreach Coordinator at Catholic Community Service. Catholic Community Service is a regional nonprofit here in Southeast Alaska. We are made up of two divisions. The first being the Safe Child Advocacy Center, where we work with law enforcement to investigate suspected cases of child abuse. And the second one, the larger division, is Southeast Senior Services, where we have a number of different programs, one of which we're highlighting tonight with the Senior and Caregiver Outreach Center, which we have our family support advocate or caregiver support advocate, Darby, giving a presentation tonight. Denny works with caregivers and also seniors who reach out to the Resource Center asking questions all about caregiving, aging in place. And Denny kind of fields those questions and helps them through the process of figuring out the information that they need to know and then where they need to go from there. She's kind of the almost welcoming point when it comes to senior services at the Caregiver and Senior Resource Center. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Denny for the first installment of our Caregiver Education Speaker Series. Denny, take it away.
Well, hello, everyone. As Erin said, my name is Denny Darby, and I have a few hats at Southeast Senior Services. I help manage the Caregiver Resource Center, and I also am a family caregiver support advocate, which means that part of my job is to help administer the Family Caregiver Support Grant. I also facilitate the Juneau Parkinson Support Group. So this year, we have decided on topics based on our experiences in the previous year. And so I'm giving this discussion tonight because I have conversations, I've had over 100 conversations with caregivers. And I thought it was very important that we talk about choices for long-term care, having the hard conversation. And the reason that the discussion is named that is because talking about choices for long-term care is hard. And so I spend quite a bit of time having these conversations with caregivers. And many of you have probably talked to me on the phone. Next slide. Erin? Okay. So I wanted to decide on a few definitions, though. One of the things that we when people think about long-term care, it's generally you think about long-term care in terms of care outside the home, in a place like the Pioneer Home or other types of places that offer long-term care outside the home. For the purposes of this discussion, long-term care, I'm defining it as long-term care in the home or out of the home. That, for the purposes of this discussion, is the definition of long-term care. And so a caregiver is that person that is caring for their elder. And now that elder could be somebody they're related to or somebody they live next to, a friend, like that. So I speak with 100 clients or so. I have about 100 clients in Southeast Alaska. And when you call the Resource Center and you're asking for services that we provide, I'll do a short intake with you. And in that intake, I'm going to ask questions about your elder and like their age, their health, just general questions related to the types of services that we're offering. So often during the time that I'm talking with a caregiver, eventually the discussion gets into what are your plans for long-term care? If a caregiver is telling me that their elder is a fall risk, has fallen a lot, or that their elder is showing signs of dementia, it could be early dementia or like mid dementia, those are kind of red flags in my mind that's saying that it might be a good thing to talk to that caregiver about what are their plans. And when I do have that conversation over it will be 2 years in March that I've been at the Resource Center, I would say that probably only 5 to 10% of caregivers have a plan in place to provide long-term care for their elders. So what are the reasons for this lack of planning? Next slide. So I think part of it is there's cultural blind spots. So very few homes have multi-generational families living in the same home. If you stop and think about it, ask yourself, how many people do you know that have children, their parents, grandparents, and maybe even great-grandparents living in the same home, let alone the same city? So a lot of the times, I think that a lot of people don't understand the aging process, and they don't understand what can happen when their elder gets to a certain stage of their life. And so we tend to think about aging theoretically. We know that aging is going to happen to us all sometime, but that's down the road. And so one of the things that happens is that this all kind of creeps up on people before they're ready, and they just sort of kind of go, well, I know that's happening someday, but it's not happening now. So, and I also think there's a cultural bias because in our society, senior citizens are just really not seen that much. They're at home. We don't have our senior citizens out and about, and especially since COVID, even more so. The other reason for this, I think, is denial. So I have a lot of people, caregivers that call me, are not biologically related to their elder. I will get a call, and often it's the daughter-in-law or the son-in-law or someone else who notices that the elder needs care. And particularly if the elder is showing signs of dementia, oftentimes the biological offspring, like the son or the daughter, they don't want to see that. And so they'll just sort of say, no, this isn't happening. And so often it's the person, like not the son-in-law or the daughter-in-law, that gives me a call. Next slide, please. And then another thing to think about is people assume the services are there. So for instance, I had a guy call me the other day from Washington, D.C., and that's another thing. If you're a caregiver and your elder is here in Juneau and you're even outside the state, you can still be a caregiver and your elder can still receive services. So this fellow called from Washington, D.C., just saying, you know, my mom is starting to show signs of dementia, and I think we need some, someone to come into the home, and they assume that the service is there. And unfortunately, right now in Southeast Alaska, and I think it's probably the same all over, there is a chronic staffing shortage in the home care agencies that we work with that provide home care services. And so finding those kinds of services are not as easy as people assume. Another thing people assume is that they can just call up the Pioneer home and have their elder move in there, and they have an assumption that these services are there. So another thing that really doesn't help this at all is family dysfunction. So I oftentimes, well, every now and then I'll get a call from a sibling who has several siblings in the family, and the elder, the mom or the dad or somebody, needs help. But the siblings cannot decide how that help should occur, and that you have different siblings with different agendas. So it is, when there's a lot of family dysfunction, trying to provide help for the elder, it can be very difficult. And lastly, our elders are stubborn. We have to remember that some of these people have grown up here before it was a state, before Alaska was a state. And the thing about elders, when you get older, your home becomes very important to you. As the outside world becomes harder and harder to understand, especially with technology, your home makes sense. In your home, you feel safe. So a lot of elders are extremely stubborn and they don't want to leave their homes. Next slide. So what I suggest is, when you're thinking about long-term care, whether it is in the home or out of the home, and Catholic Community Services and Southeast Senior Services support caregivers and elders staying in their homes as long as possible. Studies show that elders are happier at home and it's much less expensive. So one of the things you need to do when deciding on long-term care choices, whether to have long-term care in the home or outside the home, is to take stock. You need to look around your life and you need to ask yourself, how much available support do I have? If you, do you have a large family? Do you have a lot of friends? Do you belong to a church or other organizations that can also lend help? Because if you decide to provide long-term care in your home, you're going to need a lot of help. The other thing that you want to consider are financial resources. There are certain long-term care facilities that are private pay. For instance, Riverview is a new long-term care facility that's being built in Juneau and is supposed to be operable at the beginning of next year. That facility is a private pay facility, whereas the Pioneer Home is partially sponsored and subsidized by the state. So depending on your financial resources, you need to look around and see what type of long-term facility, whether in the home or out of the home, is going to work for you. Next slide. So there are 6 long-term care facilities in Alaska, or 6 Pioneer homes. So this is a list of all the Pioneer homes. So there are approximately 6,000 people on the inactive list. The oldest registration is from 1993. The longest wait lists for the Pioneer Home are in Juneau and Fairbanks, and Juneau's wait list is 10 to 15 years, while Anchorage and Sitka have the shortest wait lists. Next slide. And these are a list of all the other long-term care facilities throughout Southeast Alaska. These are not Pioneer homes, but they're associated with Search or some other type of organization has built these homes and are running these homes. Next slide. So one thing you want to consider too is the wishes of the elder. All right. And as I said, you know, many of these people were raised when Alaska was still a territory. You need to take into account their wishes. Also, you need to take into account your personal health as a caregiver. Caregiving is extremely stressful. And a lot of caregivers, if you have a parent, an elder that's in their 90s or late 80s, you could be in your late 60s or 70s. So you need to take that into consideration. And once you've decided on long-term care, whether it's in the home or out of the home, you need to make a decision what you're going to do. Next slide. So this is a scaffolding, and I think it's a great visual. A scaffolding is something that you support, it's something that you build up to help you get around, if you will. So at the top, when you want to build scaffolding, the first thing that you want to get in order are legal and medical forms and documents. And these are the types of medical and legal records: a power of attorney, an advanced healthcare directive, and a will. And last year, during our caregiver series, Beth Chapman is a lawyer and specializes in this. You can access that video through our Facebook page and on our website. And if you have any questions about any of these legal and medical forms, you could watch that video and you will get a lot of information. And so if you're providing in-home long-term care, it takes a village. It takes as much support as you can muster up. There are a couple of programs out there that can be helpful. One of them is the VA Voice program. That is for, let's say your elder is a veteran. And that is a program that if you're interested in that, contact SAIL, SAIL, and they are the people that can help you with that program. So the Voice program is a program that allows vets to stay in their home and to take control of how they're going to manage their care. And so veterans are given a budget of how much they can spend. And so it's a great program. It takes a while to get on that program, but if your elder is a veteran, I highly suggest you call SAIL. That's the, let's see, Southeast Alaska Independent Living Center, and you can call and talk to them. So the Medicaid waiver program is another program. So Medicaid waivers is different than Medicaid. A Medicaid waiver is something that if an individual is sufficiently disabled in one way or another, you can apply for a Medicaid waiver. And if you're on a Medicaid waiver, a lot of in-home services and other services are available to you that are not if you're just on Medicaid. And then if your elder is moving into long-term care away from home, you need to start making kind of plans. You need to kind of consider what you're going to take, what the elder's going to take with them, and you know, kind of get the things that they value that they can have with them when they go. And another thing is you might look into a Miller's Trust. And a Miller's Trust is a way that if, let's say, you want to go into the Pioneer home. So Medicare does not pay for long-term care. And so what you can do is, if, let's say, you're on, you are on Medicare and you have a bit of savings, if you don't have a lot of savings, and we're talking maybe $200 or $300 above the level to apply for Medicaid, you can create a Miller's Trust. And that is a way of putting some of your money aside so that not all of it goes to the institution. And again, Beth Chapman can tell you about Miller's Trust, or she can refer you to somebody that specializes in that. Next slide. Okay, so what happens if plans are not made? And this kind of goes back to understanding kind of what happens to elders at this stage of life. Oftentimes, what is going to happen with an elder is eventually the elder is either going to fall, or they might get a UTI or some other disease and needs to be hospitalized. Okay, oftentimes that happens, not all the time, but oftentimes. And once that happens, once they are admitted into the hospital, often the elder's dementia and other chronic conditions accelerate. And then what the hospital will do is they will stabilize your elder, and then your elder will be discharged back home. And this often starts kind of a revolving door, because your elder comes home, but they are more frail than when they went in the hospital. And eventually some time will pass and something else will happen, and your elder could be hospitalized again. And this kind of keeps happening. And then eventually your elder, they're going to require some type of long-term care. And if the family or the elder doesn't have any plans for long-term care, The social workers at the hospital will work with you to find some kind of facility for the elder. Another thing that can happen is the caregiver can become ill and can no longer care for the elder. Caregiving is extremely stressful. So what happens with a lot of caregivers, and I know these people, they talk to me often, is the stress of caring for that elder, the caregiver stops eating correctly, they don't exercise correctly, they stop getting adequate sleep, and then they stop doing the things that they enjoy, and eventually their health suffers. So while last year we had a speaker, Laura Wayman, who is an author of the best-selling book, A Loving Approach to Dementia. And during her webinar that she gave us last year, she made a statement that said, unless caregivers get sufficient support in caring for their elder, 63% of them can die before the person they're caring for. And so that is really kind of dramatic. And so I think caregivers really need to take a look at that. Next slide. So in conclusion, today I highly suggest in order to avoid a crisis situation, today begin the conversation with your elder, your family, and the family doctor. And one of the things that works here that I have found is oftentimes I will have caregivers call, for instance, you might have an elder that has dementia that won't stop driving. And the caregiver will call and say, I don't know, he won't stop driving. And I can't make him stop driving, but half the time he doesn't know where he's going. So my suggestion is oftentimes people of this generation highly respect authority. So if you have somebody in your family, like the family doctor that your elder respects, and if your elder really should not be driving, you can talk to the family doctor and say, look, I need an ally. Would you please help me with these things? If you don't have a lot of support, and maybe the best decision would be for your elder to go into some kind of long-term care outside the home, but your elder is just flat out adamant, I'm not doing it, and gets really angry and lashes out, again, the family doctor can be a great ally. And then tie up loose ends. Get the will, the power of attorney, healthcare directives, etc. Have all that completed so that when your elder is ready to transition into that next stage, or God, something happens to that elder, that you have the legal authority to make decisions. And if you choose long-term care outside of the home, ask, how long is the wait list? No, I had a lady today that called, and her mother was fine. She was living independently, and then all of a sudden she had 4 falls last week. So this woman called me, and she had no idea what to do, where to start. And I asked her if her mother was on the list for the Pioneer Home, and she said, yeah, she registered last year. So right away, we know that if the wait list for the Pioneer Home is 10 to 15 years, this woman and her mother, they're going to have to make some alternative plans, and try to avoid a crisis situation, because this is what we see all the time, is when people don't have these plans in place and then something happens with the elder, you are going to have to make decisions that you probably don't want to make, and the situation is not going to be optimal. Here is an example. I had a lovely man in my Parkinson's support group. He and his wife are just beautiful people. However, a couple of months ago, he fell a couple of times. He ended up in the hospital. He got COVID, and he had to go into a private nursing home here in Juneau. and then back into the hospital. And all of a sudden, his wife, they're both in a crisis situation. And so she had to make some last minute plans on the fly. And they ended up moving to the Detroit area where he could get long-term care in a home. And she still has her home back here, and she's trying to figure out how to get to tie all this up while she's still looking after her husband in Detroit. So these are things that you want to try to avoid. Next slide. And any questions, you can contact me. This is my contact information, and I'm more than happy to speak to you. And if there's any way that I can help, I'd be happy to do that. And that's it.
Thank you, Denny. Really great presentation. I had a question for you, specifically about the 10 to 15 year wait list is very daunting information to have. Does that mean that there is no hope? Is it automatically a write-off? Or could you maybe talk to that specifically on what that process might look like? Are there exceptions, or how does that work?
Well, so everything is based off the day that you make a registration with a Pioneer Home. So you get a registration date. That is your date. It's like tattooed. That's it. So you can go on the inactive list if you wish, or you can go, or if you think you need long-term care right now, you can go on the active list, right? And so what you're going to do is you're going to work your way up that active list, right? You could get near the top of that active list, and somebody that has an older registration date than you on the inactive list could say, oh, I'm ready to go into long-term care, and they can go on the active list, and then they bump you back down. That's sort of how that works. And so when a spot becomes available, the people at the long-term care, they will start on the active list, and they will start calling people, but it depends on the type of room that's available. Like there are people that want to move into long-term care with their spouse. And so if it isn't that type of situation, they may say, no, I'm going to wait for what I want. So the people at the Pioneer Home will continue moving down the list. And that's just kind of how it works. So 10 to 15 years is daunting. There's 6,000 people on the inactive list throughout the state of Alaska. So that doesn't mean, of course, that all those 6,000 people are going to end up on the active list. A lot of things can happen, but there's a lot of people throughout Alaska who are working toward, having a place on the Pioneer Home. So the people with the shortest list, as I mentioned before, and this is sometimes what happens, is people will go to a different Pioneer Home like Anchorage or Sitka that has a shorter list until a spot is available in Juneau, and then they can transfer back to Juneau.
Thank you.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it definitely did. I think it helps kind of shed light on a little bit more rather than just like completely writing off the opportunity. It does speak more to the kind of nuance of the situation. And another question for you is, we did talk a lot about facility care on this talk, which is great. Could you talk a little bit about long-term care and maybe how home care plays a part of that, and what those options look like in Southeast?
Well, like having long-term care in the home, is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Well,
so
yes. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, I'm all for people choosing to have long-term care in the home. I have a client who is caring for her mother. Her mother is in the mid to late stages of dementia. And this woman is adamant. She said, I'm going to take care of my mother. I promised her she's going to be with us until she dies. And so this woman has organized people. She runs a store somewhere. So she's getting people set up where that can come into the store for a while so she can go get rest, because that's really the main thing for caregivers, is just getting a break. And so she's setting that up to have everything ready. Okay. the one thing that people need to understand is that as some of our elders get older, especially if they have some type of dementia or Alzheimer's disease, they often will begin sundowning, which is they begin being awake at night. And so caregivers can endure a lot. They can be with their caregiver, they can do all that, or their elder all day long. But when things start to really get into a crisis situation is when the person with dementia starts sundowning, because then they're awake at night. And then the caregiver can't go to sleep because they don't know what the elder is doing.
Yeah.
They don't know if they decided to take a walk, or they've decided to, cook something, or they've decided, it could be anything. So then the caregiver is now awake pretty well 24 hours. Maybe they might doze if the elder is taking a nap. The caregiver, it's kind of like, when you're a mother, you sleep when your baby's asleep. It's kind of the same thing. But eventually this just gets to the point where the caregiver becomes exhausted.
All right, well, those are my 2 questions. Denny, thank you so much for this wonderful talk and getting this information, really important information, out into the public. As we said at the beginning of the webinar, this has been recorded and it's going to be shared onto our YouTube and then also on our Facebook page. It's going to be on our YouTube page underneath the 2022 Caregiver Education Speaker Series playlist. So we'll be uploading all of our recordings to that one playlist, so everything will be right in one spot. And I don't think our one live visitor that we have, I didn't see any questions in the chat, but thank you so much for attending with us today. If you have more information about Catholic Community Service, feel free to check out our website, and thank you.
Thank you, Denny.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.